Picture this. It's 1326 and England's most powerful judge is traveling through Leicestershire, when suddenly, armed men emerge from the shadows. Within minutes, Sir Richard Willoughby, the king's own justice, finds himself bound, blindfolded, and dragged into the wilderness. His captors? Not common bandits or desperate peasants. They were the sons of a lord. Welcome to the twisted tale of England's first organized crime family, the Folvilles. For 20 years, these brothers turned the English Midlands into their personal kingdom of terror, proving that sometimes the most dangerous criminals wear noble blood like a crown. In the turbulent 14th century, when England was torn between warring kings and rebellious barons, one family seized the chaos as their opportunity. The Folvilles weren't exactly your typical medieval criminals. They were the sons of Sir John de Folville, a respected Leicestershire lord. Yet somehow, this noble bloodline produced what historians now recognize as England's first true crime syndicate. Led by the cunning Eustace Folville, this brotherhood of seven turned their ancestral lands into the base of operations for murder, extortion, kidnapping, and rape. But here's what makes their story truly extraordinary. They didn't just commit crimes, they perfected them. They exploited legal loopholes, manipulated political turmoil, and somehow convinced kings to pardon them, only to return to their criminal empire stronger than ever. Today we're diving deep into the shadows of medieval England to uncover how a family of lords became a dynasty of criminals, and how their most audacious crime, the kidnapping of the king's own judge, nearly brought down the entire royal justice system. To understand how the Folvilles rose to power, we must first understand the England they inhabited. The early 14th century was a time of unprecedented chaos. Edward II's disastrous reign had ended in his gruesome murder at Berkeley Castle. His son, Edward III, was barely a teenager when he took the throne, leaving the realm vulnerable to ambitious nobles and opportunistic criminals. In this power vacuum, local lords often acted with impunity. The royal courts were overwhelmed, law enforcement was virtually non-existent in rural areas, and justice depended more on wealth and connections than actual guilt or innocence. It was the perfect storm for criminal enterprise, and the Folville brothers were about to prove just how perfect. The family seat was Ashby Folville in Leicestershire, a strategic location that controlled key roads between major cities. When their father, Sir John, died around 1310, he left behind 7 sons and a legacy that none could have predicted would transform into England's most notorious criminal empire. Let me introduce you to England's first crime family. At the head stood Eustace Folville, the mastermind, educated, charismatic, and utterly ruthless. Eustace possessed something rare among medieval criminals: strategic thinking. He understood that successful crime required more than brute force. It needed organization, political connections, and most importantly, the appearance of legitimacy. His brothers each brought their own talents to the enterprise. There was Richard, the enforcer, who specialized in, let's say, intimidation and violence. John, who managed their network of informants and safe houses. Lawrence, their inside man who maintained connections with corrupt officials. Robert, Thomas, and Walter, each contributing to what became a sophisticated criminal organization that would make modern crime families proud. But here's what made them truly dangerous. They operated under the protection of noble birth. When common criminals were hanged without trial, the Folvilles demanded and received formal hearings. When they were convicted, they used their connections to secure royal pardons. They turned the very legal system designed to stop them into their greatest weapon. The Folville operation was breathtakingly comprehensive. They controlled the roads around Leicestershire like a medieval mafia, demanding taxes from merchants and travelers. Those who refused to pay faced robbery, assault, or worse. But simple highway robbery was just the beginning. See, they perfected the art of extortion, sending threatening letters to wealthy landowners and church officials. Pay up or face the consequences. These weren't idle threats. The brothers had a reputation for brutal violence that made even the most stubborn victims reach for their purses. Gang's crimes escalated horrifically. Murder became routine. Rape was used as a weapon of terror and control. They burned homes, destroyed crops, and left a trail of devastation across the Midlands that lasted for 2 decades. Yet somehow, they always managed to stay one step ahead of justice. Their secret? They understood that medieval England ran on connections, not really laws. They cultivated relationships with corrupt sheriffs, bought off local officials, and most crucially, they offered their services to powerful lords engaged in political feuds. The Folvilles weren't just criminals. They were mercenaries, assassins, and political operators rolled into one terrifying package. But it was January 1326 when the Folvilles committed their most audacious crime, one so shocking that it sent tremors through the very foundations of English justice. See, Sir Richard Willoughby was no ordinary victim. He was one of the king's most trusted justices, a man who had sentenced countless criminals to death. He represented the absolute authority of royal law, and on that cold January morning, as he traveled through Leicestershire on official business, he rode straight into Eustace Folville's carefully laid trap. The attack was lightning fast and brutally efficient. Willoughby's small escort was overwhelmed in minutes. The royal justice himself was bound, blindfolded, and spirited away to a secret location deep in the Leicestershire countryside. But this wasn't just kidnapping. See, it was a direct assault on the crown's authority. The ransom demand was staggering. 1,300 marks, equivalent to hundreds of thousands of pounds today. But more than money, the Folvilles wanted something unprecedented. They demanded that Willoughby use his judicial authority to arrange pardons and legal protections for their past crimes. They were literally holding the king's justice hostage to pervert the course of justice itself. For months, one of England's most powerful men remained a prisoner of criminals who were technically his social inferiors. The very foundations of medieval hierarchy, that nobles were inherently superior to commoners, that royal authority was absolute, crumbled in a Leicestershire hideout where a judge begged for his life from the sons of a minor lord. The kidnapping of Sir Richard Willoughby sent shockwaves through the English establishment. This wasn't just crime, it was revolution. If the king's own justices could be seized with impunity, what did that say about royal authority? The response was swift and unprecedented. King Edward III himself took personal interest in the case. Royal investigators flooded Leicestershire. Rewards were offered. Threats were made. But the Folvilles had spent years building their network of protection and intimidation. Witnesses were too terrified to speak. Officials had been bought off. The brothers seemed untouchable. Meanwhile, Sir Richard Willoughby remained captive, his fate hanging in the balance. The ransom negotiations revealed the sophisticated nature of the Folville operation. They didn't just want money. They wanted legal immunity for their entire criminal empire. They were essentially demanding that the crown legitimize their reign of terror. And here's the most shocking part. They got it. After months of captivity, Willoughby was finally released, but only after the crown agreed to grant pardons to several members of the gang. The king's justice had been forced to negotiate with criminals, setting a precedent that would haunt English law for generations. But the story doesn't end there. True to form, the Folvilles treated their pardons not as mercy but as licenses to commit more crimes. Within months of their rehabilitation, they were back to their old ways, robbing, extorting, and terrorizing with renewed confidence. They had beaten the system so thoroughly they now considered themselves above it entirely. The Folville success story inspired imitators across England. Noble families in other counties began organizing their own criminal enterprises, knowing that birth and connections could protect them from consequences. The English Midlands became a patchwork of criminal territories controlled by aristocratic gangs. The psychological impact was even more devastating. The kidnapping of Sir Richard Willoughby proved that royal authority had limits, and that those limits could be exploited by anyone with sufficient ruthlessness and organization. It was a lesson that would contribute to the growing political instability that eventually led to the Wars of the Roses. The human cost of the Folville reign of terror can never fully be calculated. Countless victims were murdered, raped, or robbed. Entire communities lived in fear. Trade routes were disrupted. The rule of law itself was undermined in ways that took generations to repair. The gang finally met their end not through royal justice, but through the very violence they had unleashed. By the 1340s, most of the brothers had died violently, killed by rivals, victims' families, or each other. Eustace himself was murdered around 1347, his criminal empire dying with him. But the precedent they had set would echo through English criminal history for centuries to come. The story of the Folville Gang forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, privilege, and justice. They weren't desperate peasants driven to crime by starvation. They were wealthy nobles who chose violence because they could get away with it. They turned noble birth from a mark of honor into a license for terror. Their tactics, exploiting legal loopholes, corrupting officials, and using legitimate businesses as fronts, sound remarkably familiar to anyone who has studied modern organized crime. The Folvilles pioneered techniques that criminal organizations still use today, proving that some aspects of human nature never really change. But perhaps most chilling is how they attacked the very concept of justice itself. When they kidnapped Sir Richard Willoughby, they weren't just committing a crime, they were declaring war on the idea that law applies equally to everyone. It's a declaration that still echoes in every courthouse where wealth and connections matter more than evidence and truth. Today, Ashby Folville is a quiet village in Leicestershire. Tourists occasionally visit the old manor house, unaware that they're standing at the headquarters of England's first crime family. The fields where Sir Richard Willoughby was held captive now grow peaceful crops, but the questions raised by the Folville Gang remain as relevant as ever. What happens when the law becomes just another tool for those with power? How do we prevent justice from being bought and sold? And most importantly, how many modern Folvilles are operating right now, protected by wealth and privilege while their victims suffer in silence? What do you think? Were the Folvilles products of their chaotic times, or would they have been criminals in any era? Did something like their criminal empire exist still today? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive into medieval crime as fascinating as I did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Crimes of the Crown, and ring that notification bell. Trust me, the rabbit hole of historical true crime goes much deeper than you might imagine, and I'll be your guide every step of the way. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, history's darkest secrets are often hiding in plain sight.